What if I told you that Ferrari has been accused of cheating before even starting the 2026 season? It's not a direct violation of the rules, but what the FIA has just revealed has divided Formula One like never before. Are Mercedes and Red Bull really cheating the regulations? Or did they simply expose the biggest loophole in decades? And how does Ferrari respond just when it seemed like it finally had a car to fight for everything? Formula One, as a competitive ecosystem, has always walked a fine line between technical ingenuity and regulatory compliance. But rarely has that line been so exposed, so on the verge of collapse, as it is now with the imminent implementation of the engine regulations for 2026. What seemed like a controlled technical transition has become a minefield, detonating a conflict that not only pits rival teams against each other, but also threatens to reconfigure the balance of power of an entire era. It all starts with a seemingly simple principle. Starting in 2026, all internal combustion engines must operate with a maximum compression ratio of 16:1, a key figure that represents a deliberate step towards a more sustainable, accessible, and balanced F1. With this change, the FIA sought to attract new manufacturers, limit costs, and reduce technical barriers that had kept certain teams at a disadvantage for the last decade. But that 16:1 figure is now the center of one of the most controversial interpretations the modern technical regulations have seen. Mercedes and Red Bull, two of the most dominant players in the hybrid era, have been singled out for developing a system that, without explicitly violating the rule, exploits one of the most delicate loopholes in the legal text. Article C 5.4.3 states that the compression ratio must be measured at room temperature and under static conditions. This seemingly harmless detail is, in reality, the open door to a universe of structural manipulation through advanced engineering. Taking advantage of the thermal expansion of materials, engineers have developed pistons and combustion chamber components that, when heated during the stroke, minimally modify their shape and size. It is not a visible or grotesque transformation. It is a millimeter dance of controlled expansion, walls that narrow to just a few hundredths of a millimeter, chamber ceilings that descend in their curved shape with surgical precision, thus generating an environment of greater internal pressure. During a cold inspection, these engines perfectly comply with the technical parameters. But when they reach the usual racing operating temperature of 120 or 130 degrees Celsius, the combustion chamber transforms into a more efficient and aggressive version of itself. The result is that this theoretical ratio of 16:1 can be raised, during critical phases of the race, to values very close to 17 or even 18:1, reaching performance levels similar to those that were allowed before the new regulations. This type of advanced thermal engineering is not new in the world of elite automotive. It has been used in aviation, space propulsion systems, and experimental alternative fuel engines. But its implementation in F1, with the specific intention of altering the behavior of the engine once on the track, represents an unprecedented ethical and technical leap. The true complexity of the case lies in the fact that this innovation has not arisen from a clear violation of the rules, but from the extreme use of a legal loophole. And that is precisely what has irritated the rest of the manufacturers the most. Teams like Ferrari, Honda, and Audi have not only not developed this type of technology, but have built their power units under a more traditional interpretation of the regulations. For them, this trick represents a betrayal of the spirit of sportsmanship and a direct threat to the integrity of the new regulations. In other words, it's not that Mercedes and Red Bull engines are illegal. The thing is that they could be designed to behave completely differently when the cameras in the garage are turned off and the traffic lights on the exit straight are turned on. That ambiguity, that duality between the visible and the hidden, is what has unleashed a storm in the paddock. And the most alarming thing is that this revelation has come before the first car of the 2026 season has even rolled. The FIA has made this situation public through controlled leaks and technical conversations with the teams, anticipating what is already shaping up to be a regulatory war. The question is no longer whether this breaks the regulations. The question is much deeper. Are we facing a genius that redefines the limits of engineering, or the beginning of a new era of covert manipulation in Formula One? The line between a brilliant solution and a camouflaged infringement in Formula One has always been as thin as the layer of paint on the body of a car. And in the case that today faces Mercedes, Red Bull, and Ferrari, that line seems to have completely evaporated. What for some represents a masterpiece of engineering, for others is nothing more than a trap carefully hidden under the protection of a regulatory vacuum. The concept that has put F1 in a state of technical emergency is based on a practice known as optimized structural thermal expansion. That is, designing engine components, especially those that define the geometry of the combustion chamber, with materials capable of deforming in a predictable manner upon reaching certain temperatures. But these are not accidental deformations or unwanted side effects. We are talking about behavior intentionally programmed in the design stage, which alters the useful combustion volume to maximize compression without violating the written regulation. This physical phenomenon is exploited precisely at the microscopic level. Pistons, cylinder heads, and internal coatings are made with advanced alloys, many of them originally developed for space missions or aeronautical reactors. These alloys, under intense heat, expand in a controlled manner, closing the internal margins of the combustion chamber just enough to increase pressure without producing contact between moving parts, without compromising reliability, and without leaving visible traces during a post-race inspection. The trick is so sophisticated that FIA technicians, when inspecting these engines in static and cold conditions as required by current regulations, do not find any anomaly. The measurements are exact, the compression ratio is correct, and everything appears to be in order. But in the race, the engine literally transforms into a different machine. Its behavior changes, its thermal efficiency skyrockets, and its power exceeds the limit that, in theory, all equipment should share. In this context, the meeting called by the FIA for January 22, 2026 becomes a critical summit. All manufacturers will be present there with their legal and technical teams. The immediate future of Formula One could be defined at that table. If legislation is passed to block the trick, there will be political retaliation and a new wave of technical adjustments. If allowed, a precedent will be consolidated that will force all teams to play the same game, breaking the balance that the new rules were intended to establish. And Ferrari, with all its history, its institutional weight, and its media influence, knows it. That's why he's not fighting just for a technical argument. He is fighting for his future. Because if this regulatory vacuum becomes technical jurisprudence, the Scuderia could go from the role of contender to victim, even before the first light goes out in 2026. January 22, 2026 will not be just another day on the Formula One calendar. It will, in all likelihood, be the most decisive moment in the start of the new technical era. And it will be so not because engines are started, but because that day, in a closed room under strict confidentiality, the main players in the category will decide whether this generation begins with clear rules, or with a void that will deform the competition from its origin. The FIA, for its part, is trapped in its own regulatory architecture. They know that intervening now, just weeks before the final specifications of the power units are frozen, would mean opening the door to legal lawsuits by the teams that have already invested millions in these solutions. But they also understand that, if they do not intervene, they will be endorsing a legal vacuum that will jeopardize the principle of equity that they promised with the 2026 revolution. In addition, there is an extra pressure that does not appear in the official statements, but that everyone in the paddock knows: commercial interests. Red Bull and Mercedes have enormous political weight in the category. They have strategic alliances, lobbying power, influence over sponsors, and an influence network that reaches the highest levels of sports marketing. Stopping them without an indisputable technical justification could fracture the delicate political balance within F1. Therefore, the result of this meeting will not only be a technical decision. It will be a clear sign of what kind of sport Formula One wants to be in the new era. One that rewards absolute ingenuity, even if it plays on the edge of an ethical void, or one that prioritizes equality and rewrites the rules to close the doors to extreme interpretations, even if that means delaying technological evolution. What is at stake is the very identity of F1 in the hybrid 2.0 era. And at that table on January 22nd, every word, every document, every gesture can be the difference between a balanced season and a hegemony sealed before the first traffic light. The current situation represents precisely that. The FIA has been surpassed by the technical creativity of its own participants, and must now decide whether to rewrite the rules of the game or let a silent advantage define the entire 2026 to 2030 cycle. And it is not an exaggeration. The power units will be frozen at the beginning of the new era, so any team that begins that cycle with a structural advantage will be able to maintain it, amplify it, and even monopolize it for 5 years. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.